From Chicago's CAN TV, this is Chicago Newsroom.
Well, hi there, and welcome to Chicago Newsroom here on CAN TV. I'm Ken Davis, welcoming you to another conversation about the city that we love to sit around and talk about. 62,000. That's how many signatures Amara Enyia submitted to the Board of Elections on November 26th. It was the largest stack of petitions they received from the couple of dozen individuals, or however many there are, who are trying to replace Rahm Emanuel. It was a larger stack, in fact, than Toni Preckwinkle's, because she only had 60,000. But because Amara Enyia isn't all that well known yet by most Chicagoans, it didn't seem to get as much of a splash in the media accounts as reporters scrambled to report on Bill Daley and Susana Mendoza and maybe Paul Vallis. Well, today on Chicago Newsroom, we have the opportunity to get to know more about Amara Enyia, policy consultant, community activist, friend of Chance the Rapper, Ironman marathoner, speaker of 5 languages, and as I understand it, even a carver of decorated wooden spoons. Amara, welcome to Chicago Newsroom. Thank you for being here.
It is so good to be here. Thank you.
I've heard you over on Ben Joravsky's show many times.
Yes.
And we have that in common. We both show up on his show from time to time.
Yes.
So anyway, the thing I think we really have to get down to right away is that just yesterday we learned that Susana Mendoza and Toni Preckwinkle got a little embarrassed about all that Ed Burke money they had, so they're giving it away, 13,000 in the case of Preckwinkle, 10 in Mendoza's. And so the first question is, what are you going to do with the $13,000 that you got from Ed Burke?
Thankfully, the $13,000 that we never got from Ed Burke.
Oh, you didn't get any?
Not at all. Not at all. Apparently other people did, but not us. Just that whole situation is emblematic of sort of what we are moving away from, which is the politics of the past and the individuals who have really benefited from systems that have hurt taxpayers and hurt residents. So we are very clear about what we represent, and so donations or funding from someone like an Ed Burke just was never on our radar anyway.
So you think you can still get elected without that $10,000?
I certainly hope so. Yes, we can. Yes.
So before we get down to real politics, who are you? We need to know who you are. I don't think it's insulting to say that many people just aren't that familiar with you. I mean, you know, when you're up against Daley and Preckwinkle and all that kind of thing. Austin Community Council, you're the head of that somehow or other. Tell us about that organization a little bit.
Yeah, so I'm the director of the Austin Chamber of Commerce.
I'm sorry. Yes, right.
Yes,
Chamber of Commerce.
Exactly. It's one of many hats that I wear. So I started off in, actually a lot of my history comes from how I was raised with certain values, because that sort of makes sense of the career choices that I've made over the course of my career. So I come from a background of family that have always been very politically engaged, but also very engaged on issues of human rights, of injustices, issues of equity. And so that actually led me not only to my organizing work, but to working in city government. So I worked in government, largely trying to understand and figure out why these systems seem to have a negative impact on so many people in the city of Chicago. And I had a front row seat to that and to understanding those systems. So I worked in the mayor's office, and when I came out, I started working on the west side of Chicago. I live on the west side, so as long as I've been in Garfield Park in the community. And what struck me as I was working in city government was that the West Side was such a non-factor in conversations. It was almost erased as though it didn't exist. And so I left city government and started working as executive director of an organization called Austin Coming Together, who just last week, with hundreds of people, released its first quality of life plan. I also worked in the advanced manufacturing sector as a policy director. And then when I moved on from Austin Coming Together, I took on the role of director of the Austin Chamber of Commerce, which allows me to do a lot of the work in the business community and in economic development, not just in Austin, but on the West Side more generally. So my career has really been, interestingly, it's having that top level government perspective, but also worked in the nonprofit sector, worked in the just the public sector generally, but also worked as an organizer at the grassroots. And so that broad perspective informs how I see public policy making and how I see change, the possibilities of change in the city.
You worked in Daley's policy office, is that right?
So in the mayor's office, so there's, my initial entry was as they have a fellowship, and you can focus on one area or you can pretty much do a little bit of everything. And so I, as is a pattern for me, have always had a broad set of policy interests. So I worked on everything from housing, that was around the time of the housing crisis, to violence prevention. One of the standout things that happened during that time was Darian Albert, a high schooler who was killed at Finger High School.
Very well remember.
So those were some of the things that really had a major impact on me. And so coming out from there, I was just consumed with how do we change these systems. And it's clear that it's not just what happens at the top level of government. The real change has to come from the bottom up. It has to be, policymaking should emanate from the grassroots. It should come from the bottom up. And that has not been the paradigm, unfortunately, in Chicago.
I can see that these notes are going to be worthless because I can see where we're going on this. I too, we have this in common. I worked in the mayor's office.
Wow.
I was there a lot earlier, though. I started in the 90s and early 90s until about 2005. And I ended up, I worked for the Department of Environment, may it rest in peace.
Yes, yes. One of the things that happened
got
that
wiped
needs to
out.
be reversed, yeah.
And then I also worked in the mayor's, as the director of municipal TV. We did all the TV work for Daley. So yes, I have this, and I spent a lot of time in the mayor's office, which is, that's a kind of a misnomer because it's actually a couple of floors full of people, and people like me. I worked in the mayor's office, but I doubt that he barely even knew that I was there. I mean, I was one of maybe 100 people.
Yes.
So I just have to sort of cul-de-sac this whole thing because it's interesting to me that a mayor's office can have a lot of people scurrying around working on policy, but in the end, you really wonder whether they have any impact on making a difference in the city, because the city is this massive organic churning thing that every day is different. And your ego can tell you that, well, we are the mayor's office, we are here to fix this, right?
Yes, but the reality, which is evidenced by what's happening in so many communities, is that there is a disconnect. That's what I saw. There was a clear disconnect between those who make policy and those who are affected by policy. And if you are not connected to people on the ground, not just those who have access to clout or access to money, but real people living in their neighborhoods, you cannot make good public policy. And so as we see what's happened over the last several years with the exacerbated displacement of individuals and families from their neighborhoods, we've seen what's happened with the disruption and dysfunction in our public school system. We have seen the lack of affordability to be able to stay here. It has only increased over the last several years, and that's a direct result of a top-down policymaking paradigm that has favored one part of the city at the expense of the neighborhoods. And so the way that you write that is you actually have to finally pay attention to the neighborhoods and recognize their value, not just because it's great to recognize the neighborhoods, but it's actually a matter of the health of our economy. It's a matter of the health of our school system and actually keeping people in Chicago. We've lost so much population, which is revenue that's actually leaving the city when our population declines.
Let's bookmark that population decline thing and make sure that we get back to it later in the conversation because it's such an important piece. It is interwoven with everything else we're going to talk about.
Yes.
But yet the irony of this is that you decided somehow in your process, in your life, that, I would like to be the mayor. So, I mean, have you changed your position on top-downism?
Not at all. So I never wanted, being an elected official has never been a lifelong dream. So I'm not one of those people who said, when I grow up, I want to be an elected official. Quite the contrary, because my parents had been involved in activism in an international context where there are some really
From Nigeria?
Yes, from Nigeria. Both.
And they're immigrants here?
They are immigrants. My father and mother both fought in our Civil War. After our ethnic group did not win the war, it was very difficult in the country. They came to the United States, continued their activism against...
This was Biafra, if I recall, right?
Yes, Biafra.
For those of us who were around and can remember that.
Yes. So very devastating circumstances. We had dictators in Nigeria. They were continuing their activism. And I saw firsthand understand the difficulty of challenging authoritarian governments and of challenging these cemented systems. And so politics and being an elected official has never been a dream of mine.
So how interesting is that, though, that you were born into a family that was, I guess we would call it politically active.
Yes.
I think it would be much more than that. So you got to see this from a very young perspective.
Yes.
That's interesting to me.
Yes, yes. Myself and I have 5 siblings, and I remember when I was maybe 13 or 14, my father was writing a book about the war. He also wrote, it was called The Blueprint for Nigeria's Democracy, and I had to type that book.
Oh, you typed it?
I did. Yes, yes, yeah. Using
Not on a word
resources.
processor.
On an old, I think it was a Mac, one of those old
Oh,
Mac
it was
computers.
actually, okay.
Yes,
yeah.
it was pretty antiquated. But I remember just from reading what he was typing about democracy, about these values of transparency, of equity. And this is when I was in middle school. And I remember the press conferences they called when they had the Nigerian government had executed 7 or 9 people who were dissidents for speaking out against the government. I remember stories where they were actually sending people to my parents' house when we were young to intimidate them because of their activism. And at the time, the children, any adults as our parents' friends, we didn't know any better. But to find out later the intimidation tactics that they underwent, and yet they continued to engage in this space of activism because they believe that we have a responsibility not to ourselves, but to serving others. And those values, I think, are what led me ultimately to running for office, and the power of the transformative power that emanates from the mayor's office, not because of the position, but because of the impact that could be had if we actually implemented transformative ideas that can change lives in the city.
See, now you're sort of ringing all kinds of bells for me, because for decades I've been having these conversations and working in the news media and everything else. And I probably would lose track in the thousands of the number of times that I've heard people talking about the transformative power and engaging the community in making its own decisions and bottom up and all these things, right?
Yes.
To me, they're almost just buzzwords at this point. But I do see an energy in you that I haven't seen for a long time, and I'm willing to give you the benefit of the doubt a little bit.
Hey, a little less cynicism.
But I'm a lot older than you are, and by definition, someone who's a lot older is just far more cynical, because we just feel like we've seen this over and over and over again.
Yes.
And I don't quite understand how this works. How do you take a community that has been impoverished for generations, that has been disinvested in criminally for generations, whose children have grown up to be less than perfect model citizens because of all of these things? How do you go to that community and say, we are now going to make you a functioning part of the city? How do you do that?
Yes. So you do it with the same intentionality that community was marginalized. So every public policy is very intentional. When we think about the lack of access to affordable housing, it didn't just pop up that way. We found that the city was actually CHA was sitting on almost $500 million of surplus while people are languishing on the waiting list. When we talk about economic investment.
Which, by the way, I just noticed they're opening up. I just saw
that.
Yeah.
Yes, finally. When we talk about economic investment, the city's stated policy for decades had actually been to invest in the Central Business District under this notion that investing in the Central Business District, the benefits would trickle out to the neighborhoods. That was the stated policy of past commissioners. So with the same intentionality that we attract headquarters, we direct financial investment and capital to the Central Business District, you take that same intentionality and direct it to those neighborhoods where opportunities exist. So when we're attracting headquarters to the downtown area, we should also recognize that there are 29 acres on Central and Lake that have been vacant since the Brock's Candy Company was shut down. There are parcels on the far south side that are vacant, that are opportunities for investment. And if leadership in the city directs investment there, then you can actually start to spur the kind of economic growth that the neighborhoods deserve. I always say that private capital tends to follow the lead of the public sector. So if they're not seeing the mayor investing in those areas, well, they have no incentive to go above and beyond to invest in those areas. That's where the role of the mayor's office is so powerful, and why we can undo a lot of those wrongs by simply changing our philosophy about what economic development should look like and what parts of the city need to benefit from those kinds of economic investments. Same thing in education, same thing in housing. It can be done, but we can't just sort of expect it to happen on its own.
But at the same time, Madam Mayor, on your first day in office, you've got a $1 billion bill coming in for the latest pension payment. You have a school system that is more stable than it's been, but still facing just critical, crunching problems.
Yes.
All of these things have a price tag on them. I mean, one way or another, there's a price tag. And you have to come up with a lot of money that's not currently in the budget, or cut the budget. I mean, that's just reality, right? I mean, you have a PhD, you understand this way better than I do. So how does that work? I mean, let's just take that one thing. Rahm Emanuel has been, I'll give him credit, he's been trying very hard to close the pension gap. He hasn't succeeded, and no one will in the next 10 or 15, 20 years, I suppose. But do you see that as something that, what's my question here? My question is, do you see it as being as critical as some of the other mayoral candidates do, or do you think that the question is softer than that, that maybe you don't have to do all these things at once? I don't know where I'm going with this, but you just seem to have a very different view of things, and I'm trying to figure out how I can click you into the real world that the mayor is going to have to face, right?
Yes, I mean, it is absolutely critical, and part of the reason why it is so critical is because of the failure to take a systemic approach to something like generating revenue. What we know now is that this sort of incremental approach of change in Chicago simply cannot work. It's not sustainable. Kicking the can down the road has led us to where we are today. So if we're going to address our revenue issues, not just for right now, but for Chicago's future, then we have to implement the kind of systemic changes that can generate revenue for the city, strengthen our economy holistically, diversify our economy, shore up our population, and also there are opportunities where we have to be saving the money that we do have. A lot of the money that we lose is lost due to unnecessary payments that we make for police misconduct cases. We'll pay $1.7 billion just on police misconduct cases alone. That's money that comes out of the city's budget that could be used to invest in education and infrastructure and so on and so forth. Also, the money that we don't see because we don't have the level of transparency in our budget. So if you actually look into the corporate fund and identify those no-bid contracts that are given for years over and over, who assesses the value that the city is actually getting?
Like what? So,
contracts for large projects, projects that are in play that had a price tag at the beginning and then the price tag is completely different at the end. The projects that are not headline projects. So we know of a few, for example, the use of TIF funds for Navy Pier or for the DePaul Stadium, but those are just there are many more projects that do not fall under scrutiny because we have not institutionalized a lot of the changes that need to happen. So when I talk about transparency and changing government, it's so that we don't have to rely on a good mayor to do these things. We build strong institutions. So even if you think about what responsive government looks like, I believe strongly that every single person running for alderman, as a standard for whether they will be quality or not, has to be committed to developing independent political engagement in their wards, something akin to people's assemblies. Because if they're not responsive to their constituencies, I already know that they won't be effective representatives of their constituencies. And for far too long, the paradigm has been the alderman representing the interest of the mayor to their ward, as opposed to the residents representing their interest to the alderman, who then represents that to me. I do not want to be in a situation where I am essentially pushing the agenda for aldermen. They have to be committed to the residents of their ward. That is a systemic change that actually institutionalizes responsiveness, as opposed to the 100% rubber stamping maybe not 100%, but a large percentage of rubber stamping that currently happens in City Hall. Those institutionalizing transparency means perhaps we don't rush through the budget where they only get a couple of weeks to review it, go through every line, and are supposed to vote intelligibly on the budget. Perhaps we have to release that earlier. Perhaps there should be built-in hearings in the wards across the city prior to an alderman being expected to vote on the budget. Perhaps those hearings should be streamed online for people who can't attend in person. In CPS, maybe our board meetings shouldn't be held in the middle of the day when many parents or guardians are working. Perhaps they could be in the evening. It doesn't matter because
it's all done in the back room anyway. So it doesn't matter what time they do it.
And that's the thing. So much of what happens doesn't happen in the light of day, and we're trying to institutionalize change, not just bring in different personalities.
Okay, so I'm trying to figure out, would you call yourself a progressive?
You know,
I can't figure you out.
So I have never been a label chaser.
Yeah.
Before progressive was a thing, my values have always sort of been my values. Before progressive was a thing, and they will be there long after the next term. I've noticed that a lot of people are quick to jump on a label, but for me, your values are the testament to where you actually stand on issues. And so I spend more time just talking about the issues in my values as opposed to trying to attach myself to a label, because as we all know, anyone can adopt a label, especially when it's the popular thing. But the testament to where they stand is in their actions and in the message that they set forth.
Well, and also, you can be a progressive on this issue and this issue and this issue, and then the other one you can be a little different.
Precisely.
And that's kind of maybe what I'm seeing here is that you have some complex thinking on things. Let's just stay for a moment with the pension issue, because not because it's the most important, but it's the most emblematic issue, because it is a question of values. All right. Mayor Emanuel, as we know, talked about trying to maybe reopen things by getting a constitutional amendment that would take away certain aspects of the existing pensions. I think we all know that story.
Yes.
Where do you stand on that?
Absolutely not. Pensions are guaranteed. The individuals who are collecting on their pensions have already done the work. Those of us who do know why the pensions are not sustainable now, it was not because these individuals didn't do the work that was requested or asked of them.
Or put their payments in.
Exactly. They did what they were supposed to do. However, government, elected officials made conscious decisions to not pay into those pensions, to take those pension holidays. They did not fulfill their end of the deal. So to me, it seems very unfair and quite frankly insidious to now attempt a constitutional amendment to cover for the mismanagement of government, and now doing so in a way that would hurt individuals who are collecting their pensions, many of whom are on fixed incomes and who are already dealing with affordability issues as it stands. So it actually erodes trust in the public sector when you put forth those sorts of proposals.
But I've had a lot of conversations recently with people who are saying, Emmanuel brought up a very good point here about this 3% compounded. I don't get that. Nobody gets that. Yeah. And I didn't even realize it was happening. And you have people who leave government service in their 50s and they get 30, 40 years of this. And by the time they're done, their salary their pension is so much higher than their salary. And that, I have to say, as someone who is one of those people, I'm one of those retirees. It doesn't feel fair, and of course I know that has been kind of put to an end because of the tiering. Now there's the second tier doesn't get it.
Exactly.
So I guess that's a question. Do you feel then that everybody who's already in that basket should just go off into their great reward with that benefit?
Well, yes. When they started to create different tiers, that was an attempt to get to this notion that people are retiring earlier, they're collecting for longer, but ultimately, when individuals signed up for their jobs, they were made a promise. And it is just fundamentally wrong to break that promise, not just because it hurts the individual, but because it erodes public trust in public institutions. Yeah. So how can anyone trust that there's even any additional benefit to getting into the public sector if the very benefit can then be curtailed at the end of their career, or even worse, as they are deeply into retirement?
the reason I'm raising these questions is not to relitigate that whole thing, but just simply to try to get a sense of where you are on that, because I think that's something that people will really want to know. I don't remember who it was, Tribune or somebody. I just copied this line down that this election will transform the trajectory of the city for the next few generations.
Yes.
I think I believe that.
Yes. Definitely. We are not just talking about what happens in 2019. We are talking about fundamentally who will get to be a Chicagoan. Will my children get to be in Chicago?
Yes.
Will their children? What would this city look like? What would it feel like? What would it be?
And parallel to that, would you, as mayor, be able to say to a young couple just marrying and thinking about where they want to settle in the United States that, hey, this is a great place for you to come. We will help you raise your children. You will be happy here. Can you say that?
Right now, it is a hard sell. Unless you are in a certain income bracket, it's a very hard sell. When people when they think about where they want to live, they think about stability. They think about, where will I send my children to school? Where will I be safe? Where can I get access to parks and recreational opportunities? And if we cannot offer that in our city, then we can't make a hard sell to someone about why they should raise their children here or why they should stay there. And again, that speaks to what's been happening over the last several years with people deciding that perhaps they can get that stability elsewhere, whether moving out of the city or out of state completely. So we have not done a good job, I think, of creating the kind of city where people can see not just their entry-level career, but that they will actually put down roots in the city.
Yeah. You know, we talk a lot about the loss of population, as we mentioned earlier, and one of the things that I think is most interesting about that is that the number of people who are leaving Chicago is actually larger than we see because a lot of other people are moving in too.
Sure.
But the problem is that the folks we're losing are the $40,000, $50,000 people, and the people we're gaining are the $200,000 people. And we need those $200,000 people too. We need everybody,
Yes.
but there's something wrong here. There's
Yes.
something that's completely out of whack.
Yes, very much so. And also the rate of the exodus, those who are coming in, they're not keeping up with the rate of the exodus. So even if you break it down demographically, we lost in the last 15 years about 250,000 Black residents in the city. But we have not been adding population to keep up.
Right.
And so the implications of that are you might be bringing in people in a higher income bracket, but not enough to keep up with the amount of revenue that we lose when hundreds of thousands of those $40,000 and $50,000 residents are leaving. There's also the compounded issue of what this looks like in neighborhoods. So you have small businesses who rely on local patrons, people who will walk by, that you have foot traffic to support the small business. In many of these areas that have lost so much population, you now do not have the kind of foot traffic to sustain the small businesses in those areas. So now you're starting to see these vacant commercial corridors. That hits us not only from the lack of business revenue, but also now your entrepreneurs can't find a good market because there's simply no people here. So when we think about population loss, beyond just the property taxes they pay, these are also the individuals that support the local businesses and business community. They're also the children that wouldn't otherwise be in our schools. And so CPS is struggling now because revenue is essentially tied to the size of the school population.
So this raises, now we're really in the heart of it, aren't we? Because, well, you know, you have the Target situation, right? Where Target wants to close 2 stores because they just don't have enough customers. I mean, frankly, it's not that they want to do business. They don't care who they do business with as long as the money's green.
Exactly.
But there aren't enough people to sustain it. And the same thing is happening with the schools. WBEZ did a thing the other day, and I wish I had written those numbers down because I had forgotten. I wanted to talk to you about that. Since 2000, the city of Chicago has closed 190 some schools and opened about 180. Don't get the numbers are close. But the fact of the matter is that while we talk about the 50 schools that were closed, that's just only a part of what happened. And we have this whole, again, Renaissance 2010 thing where we were just opening schools like crazy. We were opening them all over the place, competing with the schools that were already there. So let me ask you this, Madam Mayor. How will you be able to be in office for more than 3 years without starting to close some of these schools? You're going to have to reduce your inventory.
Well, so this has been the challenge. So Renaissance 2010 was the onslaught of privatization, and it did create the situation where schools are cannibalizing each other. And there are organizations that were big proponents of that. If you fast forward to today,
Like the mayor's office.
Yes, the mayor's office, some nonprofits that were leading that. I worked with one, in fact, that recognized and said, well, that strategy of opening these new schools was not the right strategy. Even what we know about charter schools has changed over the years. They are not the panacea. We want to shift our lens to equity and lifting up community voice. And because of how crucial it is to have that shift in thinking, that's part of the reasons why I engage in those kinds of, that kind of work.
Did you ever talk about this when you were in the policy office? I mean, I guess that cat was already out of the bag or whatever at that point.
Yeah, and it was still, there was still this sense that charter schools were the answer.
Yeah.
We didn't really, the data came out a little bit later that showed that the achievement in charters was not markedly better than publics, and in many instances was worse, and a whole host of other problems.
Not to mention that they were costing a lot more money to
Costing
run.
more, not accountable, many issues that we see very clearly today. Those of us who worked in education, so for me, I'd worked in organizing for years, and we were sounding the alarm about what would happen if these schools were closed. And so there was actually a study that came out earlier this year that showed that the students from those closed schools actually fared worse in their receiving schools, the schools that they ended up going to. And we knew that to be the case when we were saying we don't need to close these schools. We need to actually start to reimagine what a quality education should look like and what it takes to create that kind of experience. CPS has not done that. Instead, the lack of foresight and planning is why you would go on an opening blitz, even as the CPS district population is declining and the city population is declining. So they created the perfect storm that now leaves us in the situation where we have buildings that have 50 kids in a class, in a graduating class. I spoke at a graduation at a school on the west side where there were maybe 36 students that graduated, and those 36 students deserve a quality education. They deserve a good high school education. We have not done enough creative thinking about what we can do to make sure that kids get a quality education. I think we have the space to do that, but it requires CPS to make some fundamentally different decisions about a few things. One, having an equity lens about how they actually allocate the resources that they do have. So there are huge gaps in terms of capital expenditures, in terms of programmatic spread. Certain areas of the city do not have IB programs. Those things exist because CPS does not operate from a lens of equity. CPS also perpetuates this stratification with the selective enrollment model, which makes sure that the selective enrollment schools get the resources that they need, but the public neighborhood schools continue to fall behind. An equity lens has to flip that so that the neighborhood schools are getting the resources that they need. The other aspect is how we draw school boundaries. So right now, in many instances, CPS draws school boundaries in ways that perpetuate segregation and actually create new schools for populations that are more valued, I would say, by the power structure, while others. Precisely. You have in Dunning with Steinmetz High School and this new proposed high school, and the way that those boundaries are drawn perpetuates that segregation and continues to marginalize schools that are deserving of the resources and need those resources. So there are institutional things that CPS has not done that they need to do, and then we have to think more creatively about how to leverage these assets, these school buildings, in favor of the individuals, the kids in those communities that need access to a quality education.
The greatest irony here is a chicken and egg irony. If you had unlimited resources, you would reopen all those schools, or maybe not all of them, but you would take the school buildings that you currently have and you would make them excellent, even if they're sitting out in the middle of nowhere and there's 20 blocks of nothing but blight all around them, because somebody's going to say, "Wow, I'll come and build a house next to that if I can get that for free," right? And you'll rebuild that community. That neighborhood will begin to, and then Target will say, maybe we're not going to close the store after all, whatever. But that's not the reality that you live in right now. You don't have the luxury of being able to build an excellent system that will attract people to come to the city. But if you want people to come to the city, you got to have that.
Yes.
So Bill Daley says we're going to have to close schools. Let's be real. We're gonna. I mean, wait, hold on a second. Where is that? Where is that? I got it right here. He said, Bill Daley at his what do you call a City Club thing the other day said that we have lost 435. Well, no. Let me start over. He said we now have 430. Let me start over one more time. In 2000, CPS had 435,000 students. Today we have 361,314 students. There are 150,000 seats that are, 150,000 seats that are open in the system right now. He says we got to close more schools. He says that right now there are 60,000 open seats, vacant seats in Tier 1 schools. So you can't keep you can't keep funding this if it's not going to improve, and if it doesn't improve, you're not going to attract more people to the city and blah blah blah.
Yeah, but it's a much more complicated issue, and I think this is the difference between being a practitioner in these spaces versus being a politician, where you can just say the numbers and say, well, as a result of that, we've got to close schools. Part of the challenge, and when we talk about investing in existing schools, is because there's a narrative about those schools. So the 60,000 available seats in level 1+ schools, some of which are in communities that people don't even realize that they have high quality schools there, because there are these narratives that persist that there are no quality schools in CPS. Part of the reason for that is when we started to push charter schools and this narrative that charters are better than neighborhood schools, now people are believing that their neighborhood schools are not good, or that there are no opportunities for a good education. So we have to consciously create a narrative that shows that public education in public neighborhood schools is quality. But CPS's investments have to be in those public neighborhood schools. We cannot demonize these schools, and then when they lose population, because either their community is losing population, the city is losing population, that funding is now tied to the number of students in the school. So now that school will lose funding. And it has nothing to do with the children, it is by circumstances out of their control. So now that should lead us to start to examine the school funding formula, student-based budgeting, which the funding follows the student. Well, you were now intrinsically penalizing schools and neighborhoods for losing population when that's not in their control. So we've got to get to some of these root issues within how CPS is structured, the institutional issues that we have to address first and foremost before we do what is the easier thing, which is to close schools. And by the way,
you don't have really control over that as mayor.
Well, the mayor right now appoints his own school board. The mayor wields an incredible amount of influence over what the school board does. Part of the push for an elected school board is because people do not feel that there's any responsiveness to the needs of the parents and children who are actually in CPS. So for the time being, he does wield a lot of power over that.
Can you believe that we've reached a point in Chicago where there is so much disgust over this that every single one of the 83 mayoral candidates all want an elected school board? I can't believe that that's happened, but it has.
Yeah, it certainly has. I mean, but it's, again, years ago, the push for an elected school board happened a long time before this election.
Of course
and many of those same voices were either completely silent or clueless on the issue. And so, again, what you have done in your track record should be a testament to how you will perform from a governance standpoint. And I think only a very few can actually say that they understand why an elected school board is necessary.
Here's the thing, though. If you're talking to that young couple and saying, we want you to come to Chicago and raise your children here, isn't it reasonable if they ask you, isn't it reasonable for me to be afraid to be in Chicago? Chicago's a scary place.
It's scary depending on where you are. And
we're talking about a lot of where you are.
Yes, and that to me is the crux of the problem. The reality is that every young couple, regardless of their race or their ethnicity or their geography, they all pretty much want the same things. They want a school, a church, some restaurants, perhaps some extracurricular activities. there is no young couple that says, I am okay being in a neighborhood where I might get shot on the way to school. No one says, I'm okay living in a food desert. However, the power structure in this city, meaning those who've been in leadership, have created systems that treat people differently based upon where they live, their ethnicity, and their socioeconomic background. And so what's happened is it has become acceptable for those communities to live with unconscionable levels of violence. It has become acceptable to shut down institutions, whether schools or otherwise, in certain communities, whereas you wouldn't dream of doing that in more affluent areas of the city. And so the message that I always talk about is a unifying message, that we all really want the same things, that whether you live in Roseland or Ravenswood or Austin or Inglewood, everyone wants and should be entitled to a high quality of life. And our public policy should support that notion, and right now it doesn't.
And you believe that you can get that message across not only to the people who don't have these things, but the people who currently do?
Yes, indeed. Because we have a shared interest. Because
I noticed when you listed your communities, you left out, Edison Park, for example.
Well, sure. I mean, Edison Park, Jefferson Park, Hegwish, I've been to all of these neighborhoods, and the reason why I can be so sure in saying we all want the same things is because I've worked and talked with and worked alongside people in all of these communities, and no one has said otherwise. But what I also know is that we have a shared interest in our advancement and in our success. And so if I'm a corporate CEO, I need to have a quality education system because I want to be able to hire from the local population, if not just for the fact that they can get to work on time if they actually live in the city. The revenue issues, the pension issues, I want the city to be sustainable because it hurts people coming here if they feel that property taxes are too high or their fees and fines are too high. So there is a benefit to whether you're a corporate CEO that's wanting to locate your headquarters here, you want to be located in an area that's safe. Right? You don't want to be limited, and when you're attracting others, if you're at the top of the supply chain and you're attracting others in that chain from a corporate standpoint, you want them to feel okay about coming to Chicago. And right now, if there's a narrative that so much of the city is mired in violence or the school system leaves a lot to be desired, you're going to have a harder time attracting the kind of companies and things that make this a global city.
I've always thought that it's just kind of a shame that there isn't a Sterling Bay that wants to buy up, as you say, that 24 acres of Brock Candy and build a really beautiful, solid, moderate income community out there. I guess there's no money in that or something. I don't know what it is. Or maybe there isn't enough TIF money to do it or whatever it is. But we don't seem to have that value. We don't place the value on attempting to not only build these communities, but to give to the children of those communities the opportunity to learn trades and to learn the kinds of jobs where you don't have to go to Northwestern for 4 years and you can earn. I know lots of people, this is kind of my world, I know lots of people who are earning $100,000 a year by going from house to house and doing plumbing work and electrical work and all that kind of stuff. And they live very good lives, thank you very much. And I would never trade one of those positions for sitting in a cubicle with a law degree somewhere in an office high-rise downtown. Not on the best of days. So I just don't quite get it. It feels like there's just some trigger that has to be pulled here somewhere. And it may be that maybe a mayor can do it. But you still have this intractable stuff of generations of embedded violence and just complete breakdown of respect for law and order. And I don't know how you can, I just don't know how you weave all these things together.
Well, you have to. And that one of the things for me is, as a systems thinker, so I think about these issues as systems and how they intersect and how they interact. So you cannot have a conversation about the economy without talking about housing. You can't have a conversation about violence, in my view, without talking about public health and exposure to public health hazards that actually create impulsive behavior in children. So that would be exposure to lead or exposure to manganese in the soil, which is a reality for many families on different parts of the city. And so we would believe that violence is this intractable thing, when really it is simply the manifestation of our public policy failings in all of these different systems. So the way that you address violence is by addressing all of those public policy failings. So you have to address public health hazard exposure. You have to address an economy where people can actually plug in, which might mean expanding trades and vocation in schools. I worked in the advanced manufacturing sector, and I know the jobs, in many instances, six-figure jobs that were vacant, they did not require a four-year degree. They just required a certification. And those jobs are there, but we have moved away from that because we shifted to this college, 100% college-bound philosophy, which is not even in alignment with the global economy. That means expanding access to vocational trades, expanding access to, I work with an organization that trains young people through adults in information technology, coding, cybersecurity, the jobs of the future. We've got to actually start preparing for that when they're in elementary school. That's what the city can do. If we invest in people and invest, quite frankly, in neighborhoods, violence becomes less of an issue. It does not become an issue. And we have to do it now because it is now becoming generational, where you have one generation that has not had parents who've been able to work, right? So our willingness to address these issues at the root, as opposed to the easy thing, which is to say, oh, we'll just put 1,000 more police on the street, or we'll just put more police, which is a very reactionary measure. Addressing it at the root actually addresses the issue. If we continue to be reactionary and do the thing that is convenient for the next news cycle, then we're 20 years from now, we'll still be talking about how to address violence in the city.
How would you convince a current police officer that you'd be a better mayor than Gary McCarthy?
Yes, that's not a hard sell at all. I mean,
it's not?
It's certainly not, because for me, when elected officials, when leadership does their job, it makes it easier for that police officer to do his or her job. So instead of expecting police to be counselors, to be babysitters, to be mental health professionals, to be all of these things, we actually have to address that in leadership in all of those public policy areas that I mentioned. When we do that, now police can focus on what they do, which is simply back end, making sure that the communities are safe. But when you close mental health clinics and then you have police getting calls for what is not criminal activity, but perhaps a psychotic break, and they have to deal with that, now we have a situation with a police-involved shooting, which is something that happened in my neighborhood a few years ago. And there's outrage because everyone will say, well, why didn't they treat the person for the mental health issues? Why did the police have to be on site? If we did our job, then the police officer doesn't have to be in their space of training, right? So our ability to do our job well makes it easier for the police officer to do his job. And our willingness to implement the reforms necessary that have been called upon for years means that now there's enhanced legitimacy within the department, and that legitimacy is what's necessary to actually have trust between community and police.
Would you move aggressively to try to implement as many of the recommendations of the police task force as you possibly can, and the consent decree? You would move positively in that
Yes,
direction.
indeed, because it's the right thing to do morally, but also because it is the financially feasible thing to do.
But you'd still be able to build a relationship with the FOP?
Indeed. I mean, there has to be a relationship there. But again, in leadership, your allegiance is first and foremost to the interests of the taxpayer, the interest of residents and of the public. And so something that would cut down on the amount that we're paying in police misconduct is in not only the interest of the police, which is the FOP's concern, but it's in the interest of taxpayers. Legitimacy legitimacy and relationship are necessary to build trust. If we can build legitimacy of the institutions, then it's easier to build trust with the communities that they have to work in. That's something that has to be a top priority.
I've been rehearsing this question for the last 4 days. I honestly have. I've been like running it by people. And it's probably the most important question I have to ask you. A town like Evanston, for example, has a mayor, and then it has a city manager. So the mayor is a policy guy, and the city manager is the person who runs the city. Chicago, as we well know, is an all-powerful oligarchical mayor. Is the oligarchical mayor system.
Yes.
The mayor not only sets policy, as you would know about policy, but the mayor also runs the city. The mayor is on the phone constantly with the police chief, with the schools chief, even with the water department. How's that 18 miles doing? I need a report. Can you do that? Can you be this policy person and this manager at the same time? Do you have any experience that tells me that when you get into office and you just start getting these constant calls, from the health department, we got a crisis over here, you would be able to guide all of these 20-some commissioners and tell them how you want things to run? Can you do that?
Yes, indeed. But
yes, indeed.
Yes, no,
confidence. The woman has confidence.
But again, it is also about creating the institution necessary to get the kind of leadership that we deserve, and that requires strong aldermen. We have to have a strong city council that can put forth quality legislation that
we have a strong city council, weak mayor government.
Right. Theoretically, in practice, it is the complete opposite.
Yes,
and so a lot of this is making sure that we do have that actual strong council, that we build in our values of transparency, of integrity, of equity into our institutions so that they do not become just buzzwords or a thing that you say, but they're actually built into the fabric of how we operate the city.
Aldermanic prerogative.
And so aldermanic prerogative is a great example, because what that does is it allows, if we're talking about housing, now, because no one wants to interfere with another
5150
alderman.
Northwest Highway.
Yes, case in point.
Yeah.
And if we don't ask critical questions as to how that has sort of pushed affordable housing only into certain areas versus others, then we will never change that paradigm. And that's another example of how it's not just who's on the fifth floor, it's also about the structure of city council and the values that aldermen have when they get elected.
Fascinating, because I've also wondered about that too. If it were possible, if you could just, with lightning bolts, reform the city council and make it into a legislative body with real committees that do real work and that actually do set policy for the city, I think it would be interesting, because you might not see things like Lincoln Yards.
Right.
You wouldn't see as many of these kinds of things.
Yes.
If there were real deliberation going on. Of course, there'd be
Yes.
graft and corruption around the edges, and there'd still be all the same problems. But philosophically and from a policy perspective, we might be a much healthier city.
Very much so. I mean,
But, I'm sorry to interrupt,
yes.
but it has never happened. No mayor has ever walked into office and said, one of the things I want to do is devolve some of my power into the city council.
Yes, and that's what makes me and my campaign different from every other campaign. We are talking about fundamental shifts that are not just buzzwords, but institutionalizing that change. I have no interest in being the mayor who's going to perpetuate the status quo, who's going to perpetuate the way things have been done. We actually benefit when we have more people engaged, when we have aldermen that actually get voted in by more than 2% of their residents. That makes the city better. And it can't just be something that we say, it has to be something that we put our policies and institutions behind. And that's what this campaign represents.
We have a choice here. We could go on and on and on for another 4 or 5 hours, or we could obey the clock and say we have to drop it. But it's just fascinating talking to you. It really is, and I'm intrigued by all of the things that you're raising. Would you take away the workers' comp function from Ed Burke? Because he'll still be an alderman when you get there.
Are you sure?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. You'll get into office, and your first call will be from Ed Burke, and he'll be telling you what you got to do today.
Yeah, and and that's fine. However, again, we are not building government around personalities. We are building strong institutions, and most municipalities that understand governance do not have workers. They actually have workers' compensation built into an agency, not under
one guy.
Exactly. So it's not personal. I'm sure we would have a pleasant conversation perhaps, but it's about how we build strong institutions. And building a strong institution mandates that it be removed from there and actually put where it's supposed to be.
Let me hear the first paragraph or two of your acceptance, well, your inaugural speech.
Well,
It's okay. You can take a minute to think about it.
Yeah, I mean,
But you must have thought about what you're going to say on that first day. It's only a few weeks away. It's in May, for God's sake.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the sense of optimism, because what we're doing is not just, this isn't a vanity project. And because there are thousands of people across the city who believe in this vision and are committed to change, they are not following against the odds. We are set to actually transform this city, to move from the city's past into the city's future, and to be able to articulate our place in that future in very specific and tangible ways. And that is exciting.
Yeah.
There's so much that we can complain about and so much that's wrong in the city, but there's an excitement about the kind of future that we can create and the kind of city that we can build that requires all hands on deck.
Yeah.
And that's an exciting prospect.
I would say this, that even in a younger life like yours, you and I have lived through a revolution unlike anything since maybe the Industrial Revolution, the digital revolution, that has empowered people in ways that we're only just beginning to glimpse. I mean, we really don't see the whole thing yet. But what we're seeing is frightening and exciting at the same time, right?
Yes.
So Chicago, through its entire history, was pretty much led the same way by strong men who basically, told people what to do. And that was probably appropriate for that time. Well, whether it was or not, it got us here anyway.
Yes.
But it doesn't work anymore.
Not
It
at all.
cannot work in this digital world.
Not
It
at
just
all.
simply can't work anymore. It's got to be a flatter organization. It's got to be a more collaborative and cooperative organization.
Yes. Yes, and that is what is so exciting. Our campaign has always been about the ideas and the next, and building the next. And when we talk about the transformative economic model, so we talk about, for example, building the cooperative economy as the future of the city and the future of our economy, those are conversations that people want to be in because they have a hand in creating their lived experience. And we all kind of sense that something has to change, that the status quo has not worked. And the changes in the direction we need to go will not happen by using or working with or pushing forth the individuals that represent the past.
We have to leave it there. So, maybe the next time we talk to you, we'll be interviewing you as mayor, and we'll see how that goes.
That'd be
All right?
fantastic.
That'd be cool.
Yes.
All right. Thank you very much, Amara Enyia. Very much enjoyed having you on the show today. And
Thank you so much.
We'll be talking later, I'm sure.
Sure.
You've been watching Chicago Newsroom here on CAN TV, and we cannot go any further without making a special note of the fact that today is the last day for Carrie Ruckel, who has been basically the, I don't know, what do you want to call her, but she's been running the background of this show for almost 10 years, and today's her last day. And Carrie, I just can't thank you enough for the guidance and the help and the, just the sort of strength of being there when things crash, right? Which happens often in this business. So thank you for everything you've done. And thank you for watching Chicago Newsroom. Don't forget that there's an address you can go to. It's this one right here, and you can see an archive of all of our shows. And especially, I'd recommend looking in on the mayoral interviews that we've been doing, because this, I think, was our 6th or 7th today. So there you go. Happy New Year to you. We'll be off for a couple of weeks, and we'll see you back here with Bill Daly right after the break. Thank you very much for watching. I'm Ken Davis. See you next time. Bye-bye.